guests today are really need no introduction. I'm going to introduce them anyway, because that's what I do. Otherwise, why would I even be here? Rebekah Karelis and Margaret Brennan. Rebekah has a Master's of Public History from WU, where she has served as an adjunct professor. As a historian for Wheeling Heritage for many years, she managed a variety of heritage projects. She co-founded Wheeling Young Preservationists and has served on the Western
Later owned by James Blaine. Now you have to zero in. I'm going to throw a lot at you here. He had married Rebekah Wilson. Now, she was the sister of Rachel Wilson, who at age 22 eloped in 1830 with 34-year-old Richard Harding. Of English descent, they went south to Alabama to make their fortune, which they never did. But when Rachel was pregnant with Rebekah, she wanted to be with her sister. She had a hard life in Alabama. So Rebekah Harding, named for her aunt, was born in this room on June 24th, 1831, 187 years ago. On a recent tour of the house, the guide said the Harding family descendants had donated this cradle, so perhaps this was Rebekah's cradle, and this came quite recently, actually. Now, the family returned to Alabama, but life was hard, and in 1836, 5 years later, when Rebekah was 5, they came to settle in Wheeling, Virginia, living for many years at this house on Webster, or today's 20th Street, near the Second Presbyterian Church lot. In a famous quote, Rebekah describes her early Wheeling. Our home consisted of 2 sleepy streets lined with Lombardy poplars, creeping between a slow-moving river and silent, brooding hills. I love that. Silent, brooding hills. Yet, Wheeling was a thriving transportation hub, and Rebekah was fascinated by the Conestoga wagons lumbering through. Mrs. Harding eventually had 8 children, 4 girls, 4 boys. Rebekah was the oldest, the first, and like so many families, several of the children did not live to adulthood. Rebekah's mother must have been quite a lady, educated by Alexander Campbell himself. Her daughter said her mother had an eager, hungry intellect and was the most accurate historian Rebekah knew. I think I would have liked this lady. Rachel encouraged her daughter and tutored Rebekah and her son Wilson, known as Wills, at home until they could receive a formal education. Those two were very close. Rebekah dedicated her first novel to my mother. Rebekah's father, Richard, a tall, handsome man, held a number of jobs through the years. A person of stern integrity and strong community spirit who loved Shakespeare. He managed the affairs of a big insurance company, and in 1850, until his death in March of 1864, 14 years, he was continuously elected the city treasurer. And his obit is up here on display. In 1845, at 14, Rebekah was admitted to the Washington Female Seminary, seen here with a marker to show the spot. It's gone, demolished. And she lived with the Blaines in the house of her birth, in the Bradford house. Another Blaine, very close to Rebekah, was James G. He was a cousin, a founder of the Republican Party, and a great statesman with roots in Washington, PA. Rebekah graduated as valedictorian. She was a great fan of Henry Clay, saw him speak, and she loved Dr. Julius Lemoyne, the abolitionist, and talked to him often. Rebekah spoke French fluently. I thought that was interesting. And after graduation, she came back home to help her mother raise and educate the children. She was close to her sister, Emily, who has descendants today. They were the ones that gave the cradle. And especially to her brother, Hugh Wilson, or Wills, another intellectual giant. He went to Washington College, later Washington and Jefferson, and taught at Wheeling's Classical Academy. Did you know we had a classical academy in the 1850s? It was at 11th and Market Street. He became principal in 1859, and Rebekah sometimes helped him there. He ended up as a revered professor at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, PA, and he's buried with the family at Washington Cemetery. I went there and tracked down the graves, and it's quite poignant because Rebekah actually wrote some of the sayings on the grave markers. The Civil War erupted, 1861, but while the states were clashing, Rebekah was writing. She had contributed to the Wheeling Intelligencer, as Alexander Campbell, of course, knew the family. Rebekah wasn't into parties or boys, it seems. Some called her bookish. She liked to walk and walked all over the city, taking in the sights and the smells and the sounds. She described that Wheeling that she saw. The idiosyncrasy of this town is smoke. It rolls sullenly in slow folds from the great chimneys of the iron foundries and settles down in black, slimy pools on muddy streets. Smoke on the wharves, smoke on the dingy boats, on the yellow river, clinging to the house front, the faces of the passers-by. Wow. Not a pretty sight. If you walked in Wheeling in those days, I guess you had a black face by the time you got home. But Wheeling was industrialized. It was different than when she first came. The Hardings had moved from Center Wheeling to Monroe, or 12th Street, where the Board of Trade is today, right across from the Union Army headquarters, the former Charles Wells Russell House. Rebekah could watch the comings and goings of the military there, and one person she met was Jessie Benton Fremont, wife of General John Fremont, the Union commander. They remained lifelong friends and kept in touch until the very end. The war had brought some embarrassment to the Hardy family because son Richard decided to leave town to join the Confederate Army. That was a big deal. He was arrested in Cincinnati and he was brought back home. He refused to swear the loyalty oath, so he was taken over to Camp Carlisle and put in prison. Tried in federal court, but then he drops out of sight. We don't know how the court case went. He is not in any public information source, and for 20 years he had little contact with the family. They were mostly Union people, and they did not look kindly. In 1861, Rebekah published her first work in the prestigious Atlantic Monthly. She started at the top, Life in the Iron Mills. It was a sensation. She began to hear from the greatest authors in the country, and one young lawyer in particular from Philadelphia, Lemuel Clark Davis. In 1862, Rebekah took a trip, by herself basically, during the war no less, to New England, and she met all the great writers. Then she journeyed to Philadelphia, where she came home engaged. Who knew? Clark, 4 years younger than Rebekah, had visited her earlier in Wheeling. They had exchanged a lot of letters, and they were married in her home March 5th, 1863. She was 31. Wow, very old. The family was Episcopalian, attending St. Matthew's, today's Blue Church, and that is one of the buildings that puts us in physical touch with Rebekah. The newlyweds left Wheeling and moved in with Clark's sister in Philadelphia. This transition was hard on Rebekah. She had kind of a mental breakdown, a severe depression. So she took a year-long rest cure under a doctor's care. She was not supposed to read or to write. It must have been terrible. But in March of 1864, her father died in Wheeling. And much later, in 1884, 20 years, her mother had died at 76 at the home in Philadelphia. So they are both buried again in Washington Cemetery. The whole clan is there. In April of 1864, after her father had just died, Rebekah gave birth to her first child, Richard Harding Davis. He could be a subject of another talk, which we hope we will give next year. He was something. In the fall of '64, the family moved into their own rented home. I'm sure that was a big help. And 2 years later, in 1866, Rebekah had a second son, Charles Belmont Davis, who also became a good writer. In 1872, a daughter, Nora, was born. Now, in 1870, the family had purchased their first home at 230 South 21st Street in Philadelphia, where they lived the rest of their lives and where a lot of people died. I visited there, and the plaque on it, you can see it barely. It says it was the home of author Richard Harding Davis. Not a word about Rebekah. She probably wouldn't have minded. That's the way she was. As the Davises settled into Philadelphia life, their stature grew. Rebekah continued her successful writing. Clark went into the newspaper business and became quite a sensation. In the 1880s, they had 4 live-in servants, and one friend commented, "Their house is full of sunshine." During the 1890s, the Davis family was one of the most prominent in the whole country. They welcomed the literati into their salon and were close friends of the Barrymores, spending their summers on the Jersey Shore with the Barrymore clan and other notables. They both loved the theater and they attended often. Rebekah and Clark lived a devoted, contented life, sitting in the evenings by the fire and critiquing each other's works. Clark became a good friend and fishing buddy of President Grover Cleveland. Rebekah liked to travel and would go south or west and gather ideas for her work. They were both interested in social causes, and Rebekah greatly supported the American Indian rights, addressed Afro-American injustices, advocated for prison reform, and she and Clark were deeply involved in the care for the mentally ill, actually helping to get Pennsylvania's laws changed. They would have fit right in today, and we could have used them. In 1904, Rebekah, at 73, published Bits of Gossip, her autobiography. If you want to look more into Rebekah's soul, I recommend you read it. By the end of that year, Clark was dead of heart trouble at 69. They were married 42 years. His obit is up here. Rebekah took one more trip with Nora to Europe in 1906, and she kept writing, although her sight was failing and she missed Clark terribly. Rebekah Harding Davis died after suffering a stroke of heart failure in September 1910 at 79 years at her son's home, Crossroad Farms in Mount Kisco, New York. The house is still there, and that's on my bucket list. I want to go there. And here we see Richard and his wife on the property. She was buried in LaBarrington Cemetery outside Philadelphia between her husband and son Richard, with Charles there too. Her husband's stone says L. Clark Davis, 1835, 1904, and his wife. She has no stone, no name, no dates for Rebekah. But she had determined that was the way it was to be. She has always wanted no public attention. Amazing. Rebekah left an estate of $50,000 divided among her 3 children. The same year she died, Julian Ward Howe, Florence Nightingale, and Mark Twain also deceased. The Davis family was all cremated, progressive for the time, perhaps because of their friendship with Dr. Julius Lemoyne of Washington, PA. I will leave you now with these words from the end of Bits of Gossip. From Rebekah. The world is crowded with brave and friendly souls, and of all the good things for which now, in the evening, I have to thank the Father of us all, the best is I have known so many of them, and for so long have kept them company. That is the end of the part of my program. Now, Rebekah Karelis, note the name, will share more with us on Rebekah Harding Davis and her literary output. Rebekah.
Thank you, Margaret. I guess I'll try holding. Margaret has brought you up to speed in an abridged way on Rebekah Harding Davis's life, which was very long, and she was a very busy lady. Now I'm going to attempt to do the same thing and share with you a little bit of her literary life, which was prolific and long, and it's impossible to condense in about 20 minutes. But I'm basically going to take some of the things that Margaret has talked about and delve a little bit deeper into each of them. In 1856, Rebekah Harding Davis, Rebekah Harding at the time in 1856, was actually listed individually in Wheeling City Directory, which is pretty unheard of in the 1850s. She was still living at home with her parents, but that kind of gives you an idea of who she was. She was very forward-thinking, kind of progressive, ahead of her time. She was like that for her entire life, and it showed in her writings and her works. She insisted on the freedom to express herself how she wanted and when she wanted, and she also maintained strong integrity in her work and in her opinions. Those really became the hallmarks of her career. She wrote for over 50 years, almost, but most striking were her writings that were written during the Civil War. And that's really kind of what I focus on for today's program. That was also, for the most part, most of them were written while she was still here in Wheeling before she moved to Philadelphia. These stories were the beginning of the realism movement, which is what she really made her mark in. She wasn't interested in the fantastical, made-up stories. She wanted to write about today, her today. And that's what she wanted to tell the story of. And the interesting and the best part about her time in Wheeling was she really provided a snapshot of life in Wheeling during the Civil War, which we don't really have a glimpse equal to that in any other way. Unlike many women writers during this time period, Rebekah had strong support from her family. She came from a family that, they were forward-thinking, and they also had literary pursuits themselves. So they encouraged Rebekah to write and educated her from a young age. And she actually had her start writing editorials in her 20s for the Wheeling Intelligencer. You see a picture behind me of Archibald Campbell, who's standing, and John Frew is seated. Rebekah was close friends with Archibald Campbell at the time of the newspaper's inception in 1852. And they'd probably been friends for a long time because, as Margaret had mentioned, Rebekah's mother, Rachel, had been educated by Archibald's uncle, Alexander Campbell. Archibald was known as a brilliant conversationalist. He was also known as a thoughtful listener who treated the opinions of the poor and wealthy with the same respect. After becoming owner and editor of the newspaper, he realized Rebekah's talents and encouraged her to write, so he was a real influence on her writing in the early days. This stage as a journalist is considered Rebekah's most influential on her writings and on her career. She learned that her fiction, like her journalism, had to be invested with something to say. Simple enough to hear, but this belief really did shape the writing of that generation in the mid to late 1800s. And many of the well-known authors of that time started in journalism and moved on to write novels. She was very partial to editorials in her 20s. In 1859, it was her first known publication, and it was entitled Women and Politics. She criticized the U.S.'s tendency to ignore the existence of women, bar them from the bench, and also the ballot box. And so she expressed her opinion about this. She really encouraged women to listen to the advice of their fathers and their brothers and hear their opinions, but also to analyze it and question it and form their own opinions. She would write a number of unsigned editorials as well as reviews of newly published works for the newspaper, and that would continue until the publishing of her first novel. Another influence on her life was Cyrus Dixon, and Margaret mentioned Cyrus. Rebekah had a lot of religious, diverse friends surrounding the family. Her mother was a Baptist. Her father preferred the Anglican religion. Her good friend, Cyrus Dixon, was the pastor at the Second Presbyterian Church, which was literally 2 or 3 buildings right down from her home. The family had several friends who were Unitarian, Quaker, and Catholic, and the family attended the Episcopal Church. And religion really played a strong role in all of her writings throughout her life. She paid special attention, especially in Life in the Iron Mills, to call out and expose what she felt were faults of certain religions or certain individuals who practiced in those religions. For instance, in Life, she wrote about a Quaker woman and a Reformed minister who failed to touch the lives of the poor because they truly misunderstood what it meant to live in Christ's example. So she called them out on it. Cyrus was a close friend through all of her life. She met him when he came to Wheeling as pastor of the Second Presbyterian Church. When he arrived, the church was at a very low point. They only had like 14 congregants at the time. And after he arrived, he was a very influential member of the church once he arrived, and there was a revival in the Second Presbyterian Church. So that kind of tells you what kind of character he was. He was only here for a couple years, but he left. He and his wife moved to Baltimore, and Rebekah maintained correspondence with him throughout her life and visited him in Baltimore. Another influence of Rebekah's early life was Fremont's, which Margaret also mentioned. General Fremont came to Wheeling as the head of the Union Army's Mountain Department when it was headquartered in Wheeling. He replaced General Rosecrans on 12th Street at the headquarters. Rebekah always admired Fremont's military skill and his supportive marriage to his wife Jessie. Jessie and Rebekah became quite close, and Rebekah described General Fremont as Fremont was the ideal soldier, simple, high-bred, courteous, always at the white heat of purpose. His wife was constantly beside him, urging the cause with all of the wonderful magnetism which then made her the most famous of American women. Rebekah and Jessie became very close while they were here in Wheeling. And Rebekah said of her, "Whatever might be in the room into which she came, she was the fire burning in it, the instrument of music that struck a note to which her secret self replied." It's high praise indeed. So the Atlantic Monthly. This was considered the premier literary periodical of the day, and it was Rebekah's desire to not stay a journalist, but she wanted to move on and join rank with the greats, the literary greats of that time, who wrote for these periodicals. It was in the Atlantic Monthly that Rebekah read from things from Hawthorne, from Whittier, Holmes, Emerson, so many other of her favorites. And she wanted her writing to be judged by the same standards. So she chose to submit her first story to the Atlantic. After submitting it, which was Life in the Iron Mills, she received a reply from its editor, James T. Fields, and she walked around with the unopened letter in her pocket for half a day because she was too scared to open it. When she did finally open it, she found an acceptance letter and $50 in payment. To place this into perspective, when her father died, his estate was worth $150. So it was a large amount of money for a woman in her late 20s to earn. Little did Rebekah know that she would never have to worry about being rejected by a publisher, and that she would be sought after by every periodical and nationally known newspaper in the country. Her first notable work appeared in the April 1861 issue of the Atlantic Monthly. The response was immediate and powerful. She received letters from all over the country from her readers, and two people were of importance that wrote to her, like Margaret told you about, Lemuel Clark Davis, who would become Rebekah's husband, but also Nathaniel Hawthorne. In Life in the Iron Mills, the story repeated themes that would continue throughout the 50 years of her writing, most notably a critique of capitalism and the inherent class inequities that accompanied it. To quote from the book, "Well, what is it to be a thief? He met the question at last face to face, wiping the clammy drops of sweat from his forehead. God made this money, the fresh air too, for his children's use. He never made the difference between poor and rich." This book was written, or this serial rather, it did not appear in book form. It was written in the aftermath of several major labor strikes in New York and Pennsylvania at the time. And the story assessed the meaning of work and its relation to its workers and to manufacturers and to the entire nation. Unfortunately, the acceptance and Rebekah's jubilation of having her story accepted by the Atlantic was overshadowed by the beginning of the Civil War. As Peg said, while the North and South were clashing in our nation's greatest conflict, Rebekah was honing her skills as a nationally known writer. Life in the Iron Mills was her first work that made people around the nation sit up and take notice of Rebekah. And actually, a few months after she submitted Life in the Iron Mills to Fields, the Atlantic editor, she submitted a second story called The Deaf and the Dumb. And James Field gave her a negative response to it, which made her panic. And she actually asked him if he wanted her to continue to be a contributor because she took the rejection so hard. But he said no, the story was just too gloomy. And this was kind of a repetitive theme between Rebekah and Fields at the Atlantic. This was during the Civil War at a very dark time in our nation, and her stories were so realistic and often focused on the negatives that the editor thought that her stories were too gloomy and they're too morbid and that they wouldn't sell. But it was always a struggle. The editor always tried to make them more sunny and happy, and she was always trying to keep them realistic. And that was a common theme. Nathaniel Hawthorne. Rebekah had sent a copy to Life in the Iron Mills to Nathaniel Hawthorne because he was her hero, basically. And she sent him a copy for two reasons: to promote her work, but also to acknowledge her indebtedness to him. She wrote in a letter with the book, "I do not think for a moment you will care what partial glimpse of this today has come to a woman's eyes in her corner, but I want to send you something. Because when the woman's eyes were child's eyes, your words used to bring the tears to them, often bring them still, and I wish to thank you for the words, if you will allow me, in even this uncouth forum." Hawthorne responded to her letter. He indicated that he intended to go to Harper's Ferry, where John Brown had led his famous raid, and then wished to come visit her in Wheeling because he wanted to meet her. She recalled her excitement. "Me? Well, I suppose Esther felt a little in that way when the king's scepter touched her." At that time during the Civil War, unfortunately, the Confederates seized control of the B&O Railroad, which would have been Hawthorne's way of getting to Wheeling, and he was unable to make that trip, so he never made it. But they continued correspondence and they became great friends. Her second serial for Atlantic was called A Story of Today. And this was a continuation of what she had started in Life in the Iron Mills. It allowed her to continue certain themes, and it allowed her to integrate more labor themes with the war. A review in Godey's proclaimed the novel, "It was likely to prove one of the best, if not the most attractive books of the season. It fairly sparkles with originality." The Christian Examiner was also impressed with its marked and original power, a welcome exception to the common run of sensational and sentimental novels. Here is an author who has something to say that demands utterance, and says it in words not skimmed from magazines and dictionaries, but stamped with the writer's own personality. Because it was a serial and published in parts, I think there were 16 parts, she was able to incorporate specific battles and specific war issues that were going on into the story as it happened. Whoops, I'm out of order. This was actually her first book to be published as a standalone novel, and the editor had her change it to Margaret Houth. So if you are looking to read this book, you can buy this book. The cover that's up there is not what would have been published in the 1860s, but that's a copy that you can find on Amazon for a couple bucks. She used in Margaret Houth a final question technique, and she used it throughout her career. Like all reform writers, she was trying to get a response from her readers. She wanted her readers engaged and frustrated and to respond. And so she would often end her stories with a question. And Margaret Houth was the first time she did this, and she says at the end, "It does not satisfy you." She would use this method through all her years of writing. So due to the urgings of her editors, the Fremonts, all her new literary friends that she corresponded with across New England, the summer of 1862, this is still during the war, had Rebekah heading for New England, New York, Philadelphia, Newport, and Baltimore to make many visits to the newfound connections that came with publishing of Life in the Iron Mills and A Story of Today. She met her editor for the first time on this trip, and she said, "I must say it, I do hope you all like me." Her first stop was to New York to spend 2 weeks with the Fremonts, then to Boston to spend time with the Fields, where she was welcomed into the literary world. If you can imagine being in an isolated place like Wheeling and writing, the population at that time was about 16,000 people, and suddenly to come into a much larger world like Boston or New York that had a literary world and literary-minded people, and not just anyone, the great literary people who were celebrities at that time, and to be known by them and counted among them. Rebekah was a little surprised, but she was very pleased to be counted as a celebrity as well. The first evening with the Fields, Oliver Wendell Holmes and his wife Amelia dined with them. He would impress her more than anyone else that she met that trip. She described him. Physically, he was a very small man, holding himself stiffly erect, but his eyes were full of wonderful fire and sympathy. She would also meet Louisa May Alcott, author of Little Women, who said, Louisa said, "These people may say pleasant things to you, but not one of them would have gone to Concord and back to see you, as I did today. I went for this gown. It's the only decent one I have. I'm very poor." After their meeting, Miss Alcott said this of Rebekah: "Saw Miss Rebekah Harding, author of Margaret Houth, which has made a good stir and is very good. A handsome, fresh, quiet woman who says she never had any troubles, though she writes about woes. I told her I had had lots of woes, so I write jolly tales, and we wondered why we each did so." From that time forward, Alcott would measure up women authors to Rebekah. For instance, when describing one woman author that she just met, she didn't like her as well as Miss Harding. Rebekah would meet leading abolitionists of the time, as well as other members of the New England literati, Sophia Ripley, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and many of the Alcott family. But it remained Holmes that she admired the best from that trip. When she mentioned to him that she liked graveyards, Holmes took her on a tour of Mount Auburn, the big cemetery outside Philadelphia. She appreciated the fact that he did not take her to the famous people's graves, but instead the lesser known, telling her of their lives, honorable and tragic. He said, "I search out the histories of these forgotten folk, and when I have found out all about them, they seem like my own friends, lying there forgotten. But I know them, and every spring, as soon as the grass begins to come up, I go my rounds to visit them and see how my dead men do." And when she left, Nathaniel Hawthorne took her hand and told her, "I am sorry you are going away. It seems as if we had known you always." This meant a lot to Rebekah, since he died 2 years later and she never saw him again. After her return to Wheeling, she continued to write. She began as a writer who wrote only for the Atlantic Monthly, but was soon lured away by other periodicals because they frankly paid more, and they allowed her to broaden her writing scope. The year 1862 saw the publishing of John Lamar, a serial called David Gaunt, and The Story of Today, or Margaret House, in novel form with the Atlantic. By 1864, Rebekah had reduced her writing with the Atlantic to 2 stories a year. They just did not pay her enough. She was a little miffed also that the editor did not try to publish her novels in Great Britain, which she really wanted. She finally succumbed and was lured away by Peterson's monthly magazine. They offered to pay her substantially more than the Atlantic did, and at that point in her life, the Harding family depended on her income. It was still during the war, and it really was able to help them support themselves. Her newfound friend and love interest, Clark Davis, was the literary editor for Peterson's magazine and encouraged her to write for it in addition to the Atlantic Monthly. During the Civil War, many periodicals declined in popularity, but Peterson's did not. Their subscriptions actually rose. She published her first story called The Murder of Glenn Ross in Peterson's. Per instructions, the periodical was only signed by a new contributor, not her name. It would be many years before she actually signed her names to her stories. The John Page series, The Murder of Glenn Ross, the character John Page was introduced. John Page was an unmarried Virginia lawyer who narrated this in the subsequent stories. It would become a vehicle through which Rebekah could articulate her opinion as a West Virginian, that the plantation elite of Richmond area were deluded by their own traditions of slavery and chivalry. There were many good mystery stories on one hand. On the other hand, there were thinly veiled judgments on Southern slavery and plantation traditions. Writing for Peterson's allowed Rebekah to have more freedom under a less strict editor. The editor there was much less strict than Fields. Fields wanted her to get rid of her gloomy stories, but Peterson's did not. And she explored many more styles of writing, like Gothic. She wrote mysteries, politically charged stories, of course the South, and the law and women's social status. Finally, publishing in another outlet beyond the Atlantic Monthly allowed her to reach a broader audience and more genres. The Galaxy magazine was her next periodical that she published in. It was actually created in direct competition with the Atlantic and the Peterson's Monthly. And the first story that she wrote for them, and the only story that she wrote for them, was Waiting for the Verdict. It would be considered one of the best serials ever published by Galaxy in its short run, and it was the first that was written by an American author. It was the story of a mulatto slave that passed as a white surgeon and fell in love with a white woman. The man would ultimately embrace his African-American roots, and the novel discusses the interracial relations in that relationship, and this took place in the 1860s. And the book ends, it's kind of anti-romantic, it doesn't have a good ending, a happy ending I should say, but the book ends with the readers waiting on the verdict, and basically waiting for the end of the Civil War and what the consequences on racial relations in our nation. The relationship that Rebekah had with the editors of the Galaxy was fraught with trouble from the get-go. They had an oral agreement, and the editors kept changing things up on her. But she did receive the most pay for this book than she had previously. Her other stories would bring her $75, $150, depending on their length. This story actually brought her $3,600. As a young mother, Rebekah continued to write for the Atlantic, the Galaxy, and Peterson's. She struggled to run a household at this point. She started having children. She struggled to run the household, care for children, and write as prolifically as she had in the past. They had a nurse for the children, but her husband Clark was often gone for work. It was during this time that many of her stories were narrated by women. such as a wife's story, a New Year's story, or the clergyman's wife, which may have hinted at some of her frustrations. The conundrum that women should have the right to a career, but also struggle to balance motherhood with that career, is as relevant an issue today as it was for Rebekah in the 1860s. This was an issue that she would struggle with her entire life. Through it all, and the rearing of 3 children, she wrote on a great many topics. After the war, her stories moved more towards social problems like prostitution, the impoverished, society's treatment of convicts. She wrote a book called Dallas Gibrave that was about that. The treatment and care of veterans after the war, especially as related to alcoholism. Rebekah was never a member of a temperance society, but she became a strong voice in that movement. The late 1800s and early 1900s found the Davis family as one of the most famous families, as Margaret briefly mentioned. But Rebekah always harked back to her West Virginia roots. In 1862, I want to share this little story with you. She actually pitched an idea to her editor Fields at the Atlantic Monthly. And she wrote a letter to him saying, "I'm a patriotic West Virginian, you know, and I think an article describing the private history of the struggle in our new state during the past year with a special reference to the question whether she shall be admitted as free or slave would interest your readers, both as a political query and a drama, don't you? If you do, I have a friend that I will persuade to write it. It is a hobby of mine, West Virginia, and I want to see her fitly sung." Fields declined. He didn't think it would make a good story. But Sharon Harris, the author of the book, surmises that the friend she refers to, the author, would have been Archibald Campbell at the Wheeling Intelligencer. Rebekah always made it a point to visit Wheeling at least once a year. Her father died during the war. Her mother lived for some time after that. But after her father died, her mother moved in with her family in Washington, PA, so left Wheeling. They still had friends and family here, though. She'd always come back. She spent a month in Wheeling in 1866, where all the smoke and grime weighed heavy on the author's spirit. She said, "All I said or did there bore the mark of the beast, as it came out saddened and cloudy, as if the smoke and soot had gone into the brain as well as skin, in spite of it being my old home." A few weeks later, she reconsidered in a letter to a friend. "It was so good and resting to go west. Nature there is prodigal of life. There is such absence of struggle or straining, such excess of beauty, of vigor, such quiet strength and absolute repose. New England may be the brain of the country, but I think its heart, the center of its warm, strong, life-giving blood out yonder, I'm glad it is my home." Often after a visit to Wheeling, her stories would be set in a Wheeling-like scene and tinged with smoke and soot, to which she referred, so it really affected her writing. So the last 2 novels that she published later on were Frances Waldo, a novel set in Europe, considering the complexity of family relations, more broadly about the impact that family secrets can have on its members, so it must have been a juicy tale. Its main character was a middle-aged woman. The other novel was Dr. Warwick's Daughters, a story of inheritance. After the novel, she would devote the remaining decade to a series of short stories and significant nonfiction and cultural commentaries. And I focus on the novels, but she wrote hundreds of stories every year. She was a very busy lady, and through the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, she was writing for dozens of periodicals by that time. Of note locally is Bits of Gossip. This is a semi-autobiographical collection of stories. A few feature her time here in Wheeling and share glimpses of our city that are not found elsewhere. Published in 1904, it was her last book published. She observes in the preface, "It always has seemed to me that each human being, before going out into the silence, should leave behind him not the story of his own life, but of the time in which he lived, as he saw it, its creed, its purpose, its queer habits, and the work which it did or left undone in the world." So Margaret briefly ran you through the family history. We felt like we couldn't do a Rebekah Harding Davis presentation without touching on Richard Harding Davis, but like she said, this could be a whole other program because Richard was quite the character. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Davis family was a celebrity family of writers. Rebekah, her husband Clark, and their sons Richard and Charlie all being well-known and prolific writers at the time. The Ladies' Home Journal published an article called A Family of Writers that identified the work of the four. In addition to Rebekah's work, Richard was regularly appearing in Scribner's, and Charlie was receiving recognition for his collection of stories and work as a publisher. Clark continued to serve as editor of another periodical, The Public Ledger. Richard is possibly the most famous of the family, due in part to his flamboyant nature. He was one of many of the elite of society and a heroic war reporter in which he made the most of his name. Rebekah's other son, Charlie, is now considered the better writer in retrospect, though he never published as prolifically as Richard did. Clark, like Rebekah, was revered as part of literati of the age as publisher, editor, and writer combined. And Nora, the one that we don't talk about as much, Rebekah's daughter, she wasn't as interested in writing as the rest of the family, but she kind of made her name as a socialite of the city of Philadelphia. And just behind me, that is a picture of Richard. And Richard was friends with, I always get his name wrong. Charles Dana Gibson. I always want to mix up Dana Gibson. And Richard was used as the model for the Gibson boy or Gibson man. You know, the Gibson girl. He was the illustrator. But Richard, as you can see in that illustration on the bottom left, that is Richard modeling for Dana. So Richard Harding Davis said of his mother after her death, "From the day you struck the first blow for labor in the iron mills on to the editorials, with all the good, the novels, the stories brought to people, you were always year after year making the way straighter, lifting up people, making them happier and better. No woman ever did better for her time than you, and no shrieking suffragette will ever understand the influence you wielded, greater than hundreds of thousands of women's votes." Rebekah Harding Davis was a celebrity, though one without a photo, which actually there are some theories that kept her celebrity and her fame down a little bit, because this was a time when a photograph or an illustration of a writer was very important in these periodicals, and the fact that she refused to give one, that supposedly kept her fame down just a little bit, unlike the others who were writing for the time. She kept pace with the literary greats of the mid-19th century, sometimes surpassing them, earning her place and status among them. She was not born in Wheeling, but her youth and her character were shaped by 20-some years spent in Wheeling. She is a product of Wheeling's story, and though the lady hated to be recognized for her accomplishments, Wheeling is proud, I think, to claim her as one of our own. For her stories are timeless and capture what she sought, her today. As written in a book review in 1896, Rebekah Harding Davis is always interesting when she writes a story, and she always has a story to tell. The end. So like Margaret said, there is the new book, Rebekah Harding Davis. It is a fabulous book. It's what Margaret and I relied on for this presentation, and it is amazing. The things that you can learn about Rebekah Harding Davis. And there are things to look up here up front if you'd like. There's actually a letter from Rebekah Harding Davis with her signature and a couple of her old books if you'd like to take a look at them. So are there any questions? Jean?
I have a question for Margaret. During your part of the talk, you showed a picture of the Charles Wells Russell House. Do I understand they lived across the street from it? They didn't live in it.
No,
Yeah.
but
Because Fremont was in it.
yeah,
Okay.
Fremont was there, not for a long time. He was only here for a couple of months. Jessie was great, and she's the one that interviewed Lydia Bob Shepherd and described the second floor ballroom with all the gowns she had around. But her husband was a piece of work. Seriously, they threw out Rosecrans because he had influential friends in D.C. Rosecrans was probably a better guy in that role. And Fremont came in and he couldn't get along with anybody. And finally they got rid of him after a couple months. But Jessie, now she's the one. She was his stalwart, wife who kept things on more an even keel. But yes, they would watch the comings. Everybody went in and out of that union headquarters, and Rebekah didn't miss anything.
So are there any pictures of what that house would look like?
Not that we are aware. Not that we are aware of.
And of course, it's a parking lot now, so.
Yeah.
John.
You mentioned the editorials you wrote in the Intelligencer, and I guess you had one that you identified.
Yes.
Are there other ones that are identifiable to see what subjects she was concerned about?
Well, that's something I'm not too sure of. I'm not sure how much Sharon, in the book, they don't really go into that, but most of her editorials were unsigned, so I'm not really sure how you could identify them.
I searched in the Intelligencer online for her name, and there said nothing at all.
They actually, Sharon surmised that she was much more active in the Wheeling Intelligencer than we realized. She even stepped in and was a substitute editor when Archibald Campbell went away for a little while. But you notice an increase in mentions of the Harding family in the newspapers, so everybody thinks that she was behind the scenes and she was responsible for that. So.
And I would say, I think it's, as you read this book, you find out, I hadn't realized that she was always proud of being a West Virginia and being from Wheeling. And she would tell people that, and we're talking about one of the most important literary figures in the whole country. And she was formed in Wheeling, Virginia, Wheeling, West Virginia. And I think that's really something to be proud of. She wrote, she knew Horace Greeley. She wrote for the New York paper. I was surprised. I knew when you start to read about her, she wrote all these editorials. A woman writing editorials in those days, I just find that amazing. I do.
Would you review quickly where she lived, what city she lived in, when, and then second of all, was she considered part of the abolitionist movement? I mean, what contacts and what role did she play?
Can you handle the cities that she lived in?
Well, basically she was born, the family moved. Her father was, he had trouble with business, with being successful. He tried very hard. In Alabama at that time, he went to Alabama after they married, so she lived there for about 5 years. But she remembered the slave culture. She would use that in her writings. Then they came to Wheeling, and somebody said, why didn't they come to Washington, PA? That's where the family was. Probably wanted to have a little distance. Wheeling was close enough that they could go back and forth. It was a thriving community, up and coming. So they figured, well, we'll do well. He would do well here. And he kind of did, but they were often near financial ruin, seriously. And they stayed in Wheeling then from 35 to when she left. But the family was still here after she went off. Her brothers and sisters were still here. And then when they dispersed, then the mother went, and then eventually, that's the mother. So then she went to Philadelphia, spent her life there. And that's basically, they always spent every summer, though, at the beach in Point Pleasant, New Jersey, with all the notables. And I actually have a friend whose husband was in where is that? Was in Point Pleasant, New Jersey. That's another place we need to go. But and then toward the end of her life, her son's place in Mount Kisco, she spent a lot of time there, and of course died there.
As for the abolitionist question, yes, she was an abolitionist, but it was a little more complicated because her character was formed in an border state, and so her beliefs were, that of a border state, so it was divided. She thought slavery was wrong, but she understood, her ideologies aligned with the North, but she understood the South. And she, because of where we lived in West Virginia with so many, the combination of the Southerners and the Northerners, she understood. Sharon Harris said it best, that she condemned slavery without condemning the South. And so she was always very conscious of that in her writings, especially during the war, because it was there were so many raw, open wounds and feelings that she didn't want to, and the war was such an important fight, and it was over such important subjects that she didn't want to, make that division in writing. I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, but yeah, so she always was very conscious of that. She was just always aware. She understood where the South was coming from, but she condemned slavery. And she was friends with many abolitionists, and she believed in what they believed in. But she was never quite the vocal, loud abolitionist. Chuck.
The subject matter for Life in the Iron Mills was about life in the iron mills, and was very concerned with social injustice. But the writing was terrible. Do you agree with that? It was florid, it was sensationalistic, it was over the top, I thought. I was surprised that it was so well received, other than the topic, which was new.
Well, you have to consider the time in which it was written, when that was the popular form of writing. Yeah, I mean, I guess you just got to kind of look at it through the lens of when it was written, and that was the kind of writing that was popular. You find that in all of the novels that were written in that time. But even her novel, I think it was just sensational in the fact that it was so different. So I'm not really sure what to tell you other than that. Margaret, do you have any comments?
Well, I think the idea, women didn't write this kind of stuff. They wrote this fluffiness out there and made things up and little magic stuff and all this. She went down into the nitty gritty. I mean, and first of all, she wasn't supposed to know this stuff. It was like, how could she know about this? What did she do? Where did she find this out? She walked, she looked, she listened. She probably peeked into windows at the foundries. She saw. She was brilliant. I mean, this was a heavy-duty intellectual lady. And to think of all she did, I was amazed. I had no idea that this little lady that walked the streets of Wheeling was into all these civil rights things. She made a difference in a real way. Her mother always taught her, you help the oppressed. If there was a needy family in the neighborhood, the Hardings gave what they had to the needy family. And she never forgot that. And she did that, they said, privately throughout her life. She would help people privately. So she was, wow, she was something.
In your knowledge, did you ever attempt to write under the name of a man in order to get published?
Neither of us think so. It sounds like it would go against her nature. All right, any other questions? Okay.
Isn't it true that she came out against women's rights to vote?
See, I need to know more. I don't pretend to know all of that. Did you catch that letter that Richard said all these wild suffragettes don't equal what you've done? She wrote about the issues of women's rights, but she didn't go on the record, I think, as being for the women to have the vote. Is that correct? She was kind of about that. And you would wonder, that's kind of interesting, and I think there's more that I need to learn about that very complicated issue. She had her own ideas on that. But she did write about how important it was for women to express themselves, blah, 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 but I don't think she ever said women have the right to vote. I don't think she did.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much for coming.
Dick here to tell you about our happening. Lunch with books. Lunch with books, that's Coxie, Coxie, Haxie, Fraxie, yells and sings. Rocks and swings with more and more. Lunch with books. Lunch with books. At the Ohio County Public Library in Wheeling, West Virginia. It'll make you feel like yodeling. Hey, yodie, 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 hey, yodie, yodie. knowledge is served.